post-war Germany, the industrial Ruhr Valley was rebuilding itself. Coal mines and steel mills roared back to life. Families settled into modest apartments and tried to leave the horrors of the war behind. But for more than 2 decades, from the late 1950s through the 1970s, the region was haunted by a quiet, unassuming man whose crimes defied imagination. Joachim Kroll, later nicknamed the Duisburg Man-Eater, stalked women and children in the shadows. When he was finally caught, the full extent of his cruelty shocked even hardened detectives. Kroll was born in 1933, the 6th of 9 children in a poor family. His father, a prisoner of war during World War II, returned home broken and abusive. Joachim grew up malnourished, shy and socially awkward. From an early age, he showed signs of developmental delay and was bullied relentlessly at school. He spent much of his time alone, watching animals and daydreaming. As a young man, he worked as a manual laborer, quietly moving from factory to factory, always staying on the fringes of society. In 1955, at age 22, Kroll committed his first known killing. He lured a young woman into the woods outside his hometown, where he strangled her. Police at the time arrested another man for the crime, an innocent man who would later die in prison. Kroll learned from this that he could get away with his crimes as long as he chose his victims carefully and kept quiet. Over the next 2 decades, Kroll struck again and again. His victims were often children or young women, people he could easily overpower. He developed a chilling routine. He would stalk his target, strangle them quickly, and then desecrate the body. Sometimes he would take parts of his victims home with him, claiming he did so because he couldn't afford meat. Police failed to connect the murders at first because they happened in different towns across the Ruhr Valley, and because Kroll was so unremarkable. Kroll lived in a small, shabby apartment in Duisburg. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, even helpful. He worked at a rubber factory, kept to himself, and never caused trouble. No one suspected that inside his home was a hidden collection of horrific trophies, and that his freezer sometimes contained things that no human being should ever eat. In 1976, Kroll killed his final victim, a 4-year-old girl. When police searched his apartment, they found pieces of the girl in his sink and freezer. At first, Kroll claimed it was just pig meat, but he soon confessed everything. Kroll calmly admitted to killing at least 14 people, though investigators believe the true number may have been higher. He explained his actions with chilling simplicity. It was cheaper than buying meat. In 1982, Kroll was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1991, having never shown remorse. Experts described Kroll as an emotionally stunted man who never matured past childhood. He was unable to form real relation, and his twisted impulses became his only source of satisfaction. One psychiatrist said, "He was not a monster in his own mind, just a man filling his needs in the only way he knew how." Kroll's story is a sobering reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. In the quiet man who seems harmless, in the neighbor who minds his own business. We remember his victims, whose lives were cut short by a man who seemed ordinary, but was anything. Some people are born broken. Others are made that way by cruelty and neglect. Karl Panzram claimed to be both. He once wrote, "I have no desire to reform myself. My only regret is that I wasn't able to do more harm." Tonight we tell the story of a man who seemed to embody pure hatred, a drifter and a killer who left a trail of destruction across the United States and beyond. Karl Panzram was born in 1891 in Minnesota to a family of poor German immigrants. His father abandoned the family when Karl was young, leaving his mother to raise several children alone. From an early age, Karl was difficult. He lied, stole, and lashed out at everyone around him. At age 11, his mother sent him to the Minnesota State Training School, a reformatory for troubled boys. There he endured brutal beatings and abuse from staff members. He later wrote, "I was reformed all right, into a worse boy than I ever was before." By his teens, Karl ran away from home and began riding the rails, crisscrossing the country as a hobo. He lived by stealing, robbing, and fighting. He spent most of his youth in and out of jails, and each time he came out, he was more bitter and more violent. "I learned that the world is full of people who would hurt you if you let them," he said later, "so I decided to hurt them first." By his 20s, Panzram had become a full-time criminal. He burglarized homes, set fires to buildings, and attacked anyone who crossed him. He even managed to burglarize the home of former US President William Howard Taft, stealing jewelry and bonds. With the money, he bought a yacht and began a deadly spree along the East Coast. In the early 1920s, Panzram lured drifters and sailors onto his yacht with promises of work. Once at sea, he would attack them, throw their bodies overboard, and sail back to shore as if nothing had happened. No one knows exactly how many men he killed this way. Some estimates say at least 10. He later wrote, "For all of these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Carl's crimes weren't limited to America. He claimed to have traveled to South America, Europe, and even Africa, leaving chaos wherever he went. In one confession, he claimed to have burned down villages, robbed churches, and killed dozens more. Though not all of his claims could be verified, investigators believe his numbers were at least partly true. In 1928, Panzram was finally caught after burglarizing a home and being overpowered by police. While in jail, he confessed to at least 21 killings and many more attacks and arsons. He refused to apologize and refused to plead insanity. "I am what the world made me," he told the judge, "and what I made myself." Panzram was sentenced to death. When his lawyers tried to appeal on his behalf, he grew furious. He wanted to die, and he wanted the world to know why. On the day of his execution in 1930, he told the hangman, "Hurry it up. I could kill 10 men in the time you're taking." He was 39 years old when he died, leaving behind a written confession that became one of the most chilling documents in American criminal history. Psychologists have called Panzram a classic example of a sociopath, a man completely devoid of empathy, who viewed other human beings only as targets. But his story also raises questions about nature versus nurture. Would he have turned out differently if his childhood hadn't been filled with violence? Or was he always destined to become what he became? Carl Panzram's life is a warning about what can happen when pain is left unchecked and when hatred festers. He saw himself as a mirror of the world's cruelty, reflecting back the violence he believed he'd suffered. But in the end, he chose his path. Carl Panzram spent his life destroying, and was proud of it. His name endures not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when humanity is stripped away. In Sacramento, California, in the late 1980s, Dorothea Puente was known as a kind-hearted woman who opened her home to those in need. She ran a boarding house for the elderly, the disabled, and the forgotten. To her neighbors, she was a grandmotherly figure, baking cookies, tending her garden, always offering a warm smile. But behind closed doors, Dorothea was hiding one of the most chilling secrets in the history of America. Dorothea Puente was born in 1929 in Redlands, California, as Dorothea Gray. Her childhood was anything but stable. Her father died when she was young, and her mother, struggling with alcoholism, abandoned the family. By age 10, Dorothea was living in an orphanage, where she learned quickly how to take care of herself. Even as a child, she developed a knack for manipulation, using her charm and tears to get what she wanted. As a young woman, Dorothea bounced from one relationship to another. She married multiple times, each husband leaving her or dying under suspicious circumstances. She developed a habit of forging checks, stealing identities, and running small-time scams. By her 40s, she'd served time in prison for theft and fraud. But each time she was released, she reinvented herself, presenting a new name, a new story, a new life. In the late 1970s, Dorothea settled in recovering alcoholics. She became known in the community as a charitable soul who gave second chances. But neighbors noticed odd things. Why did her boarders often disappear without a word? Why was she constantly digging in her yard? Why did she seem to spend so much money when her boarders were so poor? In 1982, Dorothea was investigated after a man who lived in her home overdosed. Police found dozens of prescription bottles and evidence that she had been stealing his government checks. She was convicted of financial fraud and sentenced to probation. But the investigation did not dig deeper, and Dorothea returned to her old ways almost immediately. The truth finally began to surface in 1988, when a social worker reported one of Dorothea's tenants missing, a man named Alberto Montoya. Police visited the home, where Dorothea greeted them kindly. She claimed Alberto had gone to visit family, but when they searched her yard, they made a horrifying discovery: human remains buried in the garden. As they continued digging, they found more and more bodies, 7 in total. While police were searching her property, Dorothea slipped away. She fled Sacramento and checked into a motel in Los Angeles, where she met an elderly man at a bar and tried to con him as well. But when he saw her face on the news, he called police, and Dorothea was arrested without incident. Dorotho Puente's trial lasted months. Prosecutors argued that she targeted vulnerable people, killed them quietly, and stole their government checks. Her defense claimed she was simply a kind-hearted woman who hadn't realized her tenants were dying. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified that she bought large amounts of lime and dug holes in her yard late at night. A coroner's report showed signs of sedation in the victim's systems. In 1993, Dorothea was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Experts have described Dorothea as a classic manipulator, intelligent, charming, and utterly without conscience. She used her grandmotherly appearance to disarm people, hiding the predatory instincts beneath. One investigator said, "She was the last person you'd suspect, and that's what made her so dangerous." Dorothea Puente's story is a chilling reminder of how appearances can deceive. Her neighbors saw a sweet old lady tending her garden, never suspecting that she was planting more than just flowers. Her story also shines a light on the vulnerability of marginalized people, those who are easily forgotten and too often preyed upon. The victims of Dorothea Puente deserve to be remembered, not just as nameless tenants, but as people who deserved care, respect, and dignity. They were more than just checks to be cashed, and their lives serve as a stark warning about how far greed can go when compassion is only a mask. In December of 1999, newspapers in Pakistan received a letter that would leave the entire country. A man named Javed Iqbal. And it began with these haunting words: "This is my confession." The letter went on to describe one of the most horrifying killing sprees in modern history, with a number so high it seemed almost impossible to believe. For months he had operated in the shadows, leaving no trace. But now he wanted the world to know what he had done and why. Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, Pakistan, into a wealthy and influential family. His father owned property and ran a successful business, ensuring that Javed never wanted for material things. But privilege does not guarantee happiness. As a boy, Javed was described as quiet and aloof, preferring solitude to the company of others. Though he was intelligent and did well in school, classmates said he lacked empathy and was prone to sudden fits of anger. As an adult, Javed lived alone in a modest home in Lahore. He inherited properties from his father, which he rented out and kept to himself. His neighbors saw him as a solitary figure who sometimes gave money to street children. No one suspected what he was really doing. On December 30th, 1999, Lahore police received a package addressed to them. Inside was a handwritten letter and photographs, proof of unspeakable acts committed over the previous year. In the letter, Javed claimed he had ended the lives of 100 boys, all of them street children or runaways, between the ages of 6 and 16. He described luring the boys to his home with promises of shelter and food, before taking their lives and disposing of their remains in acid-filled drums. "No one cared about these children," he wrote, "so I took it upon myself to punish them for the sins of society." The letter ended by saying his work was done, and that police would never catch him alive. The confession sparked a massive manhunt. Police rushed to the address he listed in the letter. Inside, they found acid drums still filled with the remains of his victims, as well as clothing, shoes, and photographs meticulously catalogued. On the walls of his room were chilling notes, one of which read, "My revenge is complete." But Javed himself was nowhere to be found. In his letter and later statements, Javed claimed that his motive was revenge. Years earlier, he said he had been falsely accused and beaten by police for a crime he didn't commit. He claimed he'd been humiliated and imprisoned, and that his hatred for society festered from that moment on. "If society can be cruel to me, I will be cruel to society," he wrote. He also claimed that his choice of victims, street children, was deliberate, because he believed no one cared about them. News of his crime spread quickly, shocking not just Pakistan, but the entire world. In a country deeply rooted in family and community values, the thought of one man methodically ending the lives of so many children was almost too much to comprehend. The press dubbed him the Monster of Lahore. Parents wept openly in the streets. Calls for justice and for answers rang out from every corner of the nation. After nearly a month on the run, Javed Iqbal walked into the offices of a newspaper in Lahore and surrendered. He claimed he had turned himself in because he wanted to tell his story in his own words, and because he wanted people to know he was smarter than the police. "I could have disappeared forever," he told reporters, "but I chose to come back." His trial was swift and heavily covered by the media. Prosecutors laid out the horrifying evidence, the photographs, the acid drums, the catalogue of names and clothing items. Javed remained calm and emotionless throughout. He was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death. In a rare move, the judge ordered that his sentence match the brutality of his crimes. He was to be ended in the same way as his victims, in front of the parents of the children he had taken. Before the sentence could be carried out, however, Javed was found lifeless in his cell, hanging by a bedsheet. Prison officials ruled it a suicide, though some speculated that others may have taken justice into their own hands. Psychologists who studied the case described Javed as a narcissist with deep-seated anger and a desire for control. By targeting the most vulnerable members of society, he exerted power over those who could not fight back, a twisted attempt to assert dominance over a world he believed had wronged him. His story is a stark warning about the consequences of neglect. The children he targeted were already marginalized, living on the streets with no one to protect them. His crimes forced Pakistani society to confront a painful truth, that these children were largely invisible until tragedy struck. The names of Javed Iqbal's victims are not widely known, but they deserve to be remembered, as children, as sons, as brothers, whose lives mattered, even when it seemed no one noticed. Their memory serves as a call to action, to care for the most vulnerable, so that no one can ever again prey on their invisibility. In the mid-1990s, South Africa was at a crossroads. The brutal era of apartheid had just ended. The country was trying to heal deep wounds, build a new democracy, and bring people together after decades of division. But even as the nation celebrated its freedom, one man was tearing lives apart. Between 1994 and 1995, a quiet, polite man named Moses Sitoli carried out a string of attacks that would leave over 30 women dead and an entire country gripped with fear. Moses Sitoli was in a poor family. When Moses was just 5 years old, his father died. Soon after, his mother, unable to support her children, abandoned them. Moses spent part of his childhood in an orphanage, a place he later described as cold and cruel, where he learned that no one would look out for him. He dropped out of school early and worked odd jobs to survive. By his late teens, he had begun showing violent tendencies. At 19, Moses was arrested and convicted for attacking a woman. He spent nearly 7 years in prison, where he developed a burning resentment toward women. He blamed them for his failures, claiming they had humiliated and rejected him. "In my mind," he later said, "every woman was the same." After his release in the early 1990s, Moses seemed determined to turn his life around. He got a job as a security guard and then started his own small business, a charity that claimed to help young women find employment. He would approach women on the streets, in train stations, or near shopping centers, offering them job interviews at his office. For many, desperate for work in a struggling economy, it seemed like a lifeline, but it was a trap. Moses would lure his victims to isolated fields outside Johannesburg or Pretoria under the guise of a job interview. There, he would tie them up and attack them before leaving them in the open. For months, bodies kept turning up in fields and abandoned lots, always women, always in similar conditions. The press began calling him the ABC Killer, because the crimes were concentrated in Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland. South Africa was already struggling with high crime rates and social unrest, but the ABC Killer's spree terrified people on another level. Women were afraid to walk alone. Families begged their daughters not to leave home without an escort. Police, under intense pressure to catch the killer, set up a task force. But with little forensic technology and a backlog of cases, progress was painfully slow. In late 1995, police got their first big break. A woman who had survived an attack came forward. She described her attacker as polite and well-spoken, a man who seemed trustworthy at first. She even remembered his name, Moses. Using that information, police began narrowing down their list of suspects. When police finally caught up with Moses, he tried to flee. A violent struggle followed, during which Moses was shot and injured. Even as he lay handcuffed and bleeding, he admitted nothing, but the evidence was overwhelming. His clothing and car were linked to multiple victims. Witnesses identified him. His own notebooks contained the names of women he had targeted. In 1997, Moses Sithole was tried on 38 counts of taking lives and dozens of other charges. He showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. The court heard how he had targeted vulnerable women, how he had carefully planned his attacks, and how he had kept mementos of his victims. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 2,410 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least 930 years, the longest sentence ever handed down in South Africa at the time. Psychologists described Moses Sithole as a calculating predator with no empathy. They noted his ability to charm and disarm his victims, a classic trait of someone who manipulates others to get what they want. One investigator said, "He hid his hatred behind a smile. That's what made him so dangerous." His story highlights the dangers of misplaced trust and the way predators exploit vulnerability. It also reminds us that even in times of great national change, violence and injustice can still thrive in the shadows if left unchecked. More than 30 women lost their lives at the hands of Moses Sithole. Each of them had a name, a family, and dreams for the future. We remember them tonight, and we honor them by telling their story so their lives are never forgotten. In the quiet village of Sinkota, just outside Budapest, Hungary, a strange and gruesome discovery in 1916 would shock an entire nation and leave behind one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The story of Bela Kiss is not just the story of a serial killer. It's also the story of a man who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of bodies and questions that remain unanswered to this day. Bela Kiss was born in 1877 and lived most of his adult life in Sinkota, where he worked as a tinsmith. By all accounts, he was quiet but well liked in the village. He kept to himself, but was known to be polite and even charming. He had a fondness for books, particularly ones about the occult and poisons, and kept a collection of them in his home. He also had a peculiar hobby, collecting large metal drums, which he stored behind his house. When neighbors asked what they were for, Bella simply smiled and said he used them to store gasoline, which was in short supply because of the war. No one questioned it further. Over the years, several women who had been seen with Bella disappeared without a trace. Most were widows or single women who came to Sincota after answering personal ads in newspapers. Bella told neighbors they had simply moved away or returned to family in other towns. He even showed villagers letters that he claimed the women had sent him after leaving. No one suspected anything. In 1914, when World War I broke out, Bella was drafted into the Hungarian army and left Sincota. 2 years later, in 1916, his landlord, who had been tasked with maintaining the property, noticed a foul smell coming from the backyard. The landlord decided to open one of the large metal drums stored behind the house. What he found inside would horrify even the most hardened soldier. Inside the drum was the body of a woman, preserved in alcohol. Police were called, and a full search of the property revealed a total of 24 metal drums, each containing the preserved body of a woman. Some reports suggest the final count may have been as high as 30. All of the victims were women. Many had responded to personal ads Bella had placed, offering marriage to lonely widows or single women with some savings. Police believed he had poisoned them, taken their money, and hidden their bodies in the drums. As news of the discovery spread, police immediately began searching for Bella. At first, they feared he was still armed and dangerous. Then, they received word from the army that Bella had reportedly died in combat. But when they checked hospital and military records, there was no definitive proof of his death. Witnesses claimed to have seen him alive in Budapest after the discovery, and even as far away as Vienna and Paris in the years that followed. Over the next few decades, sightings of Bela Kiss were reported all over Europe. Some claimed he had joined a traveling circus. Others believed he had escaped to America and was living under an assumed, but each lead ended in dead ends, and Bela was never captured. His ultimate fate remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Investigators speculated that Bela was motivated by greed and a desire for control. He targeted vulnerable women, often those who had no close family, and promised them love and stability. Once he had gained their trust and their money, he ended their lives and stored them as if they were trophies. Psychologists have described Bela Kiss as a classic predator, charming and manipulative, able to hide his true nature behind a facade of respectability. One criminologist noted, he treated human lives like possessions, objects to be collected and hidden away. His story serves as a warning about how easily trust can be betrayed and how appearances can be deceiving. Even in a small, close-knit village where everyone knew each other, Bela was able to hide his crimes for years. The women Bela Kiss targeted were often overlooked by society. Lonely, vulnerable, and searching for love. We remember them tonight not just as victims, but as people who deserved more than to become part of one man's dark collection. Their memory remains a haunting reminder of how cruelty can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. At the turn of the 20th century, Boston was a city of promise and progress. New hospitals and medical schools were transforming healthcare, and nurses were seen as symbols of compassion and care. But hidden behind the kind smile of one nurse was something far darker. A chilling story of betrayal, cruelty, and an obsession with power over life and death. This is the story of Jane Toppen, the woman who called herself the Angel of Death. Jane Toppen was born Honora Kelly in 1854 in Boston, Massachusetts, to an Irish immigrant family. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Jane was very young, leaving her in the care of her father, a man who struggled with alcoholism and mental illness. By the time Jane was 6, her father could no longer care for her, and she was sent to an orphanage. She was later indentured as a servant to a well-off family, where she grew up under strict rules but received an education and learned social graces. She even adopted the family's last name, becoming known as Jane Toppin. But behind her polite manners, she was already learning how to manipulate those around her. In her 30s, Jane decided to train as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts. She quickly stood out for her friendly demeanor and apparent devotion to her patients. Supervisors praised her for her work ethic and her ability to comfort the sick. But fellow nurses noticed something unsettling. Patients assigned to Jane's care often became suddenly ill and sometimes didn't recover. When questioned, Jane would reassure everyone that she had done her best, even staying late to sit by the patient's side. Her willingness to be present at the bedside made her seem like a model nurse. What no one realized at the time was that Jane was secretly administering dangerous doses of medicine to her patients, sometimes just enough to make them ill, other times enough to end their lives. Jane later confessed that she enjoyed watching her patients suffer. She would sit by their side, holding their hand, pretending to comfort them, all while knowing she was the cause of their pain. It gave me a sense of power, she later said. I had them completely in my hands. Jane left the hospital and began working as a private nurse. Her services were in high demand among wealthy families, and her reputation as a kind, reliable caregiver grew. But wherever she went, illness and death seemed to follow. When she moved in with an elderly couple she was hired to care for, both died under her watch. When she stayed with her foster sister, the woman who had grown up with her in the Toppin family, the sister fell gravely ill and passed away. And yet, Jane was never suspected. In 1901, the family of one of Jane's victims grew suspicious and demanded an autopsy. Traces of poison were found in the body and Jane was arrested shortly after. At first, she denied everything, claiming she was being framed. But soon, she began to talk. And what she said shocked everyone. Jane confessed to at least 31 killings, though some believe the real number was closer to 100. Jane's trial became a media sensation. The public was fascinated by the idea of a nurse, a profession dedicated to saving lives, being capable of such cruelty. Psychiatrists who examined her described her as highly intelligent but deeply disturbed. Jane claimed she didn't just kill for money or revenge. She did it because it brought her pleasure. I like to see them die, she said, smiling. Experts have described Jane as a classic example of a power killer, someone who takes lives not out of hatred, but out of a desire to feel control over others. Her training as a nurse gave her the perfect cover, and her charm made people trust her. One psychologist called her a predator in plain sight. Jane's story is a chilling reminder that not all threats are obvious. Even those we trust the most, caregivers, healers, family, can sometimes hide the darkest intentions. It also highlights the importance of accountability in positions of power and the need for vigilance even in places we think are safe. Jane Toppin never stood trial for her crimes. She was declared insane and committed to an asylum where she lived out the rest of her life, reportedly bragging to doctors and nurses about the lives she had taken. Her victims, many of them elderly and vulnerable, are largely forgotten today. But their lives mattered, and their memory serves as a warning about how easily trust can be betrayed. On the streets of Moscow, in the early 2000s, a quiet but chilling game was being played, and no one knew it. A young man with a calm demeanor, carrying a bag and sometimes even a chessboard, walked through Bitsa Park, a large wooded area on the city's southern edge. For years, people disappeared in that park, their stories forgotten. It wasn't until 2006 that police uncovered the truth and learned that Alexander Pichushkin was playing what he called the perfect game. Alexander Pichushkin was born in 1974 in Mytishi, a suburb of Moscow. As a child, he suffered a head injury that doctors believed caused damage to his frontal lobe. The the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and social behavior. After the accident, Alexander became withdrawn, angry, and prone to sudden outbursts. He was bullied at school and nicknamed that quiet boy by neighbors. He developed a fascination with chess, spending hours in the park playing against old men and winning most of his matches. But he also began showing disturbing behavior, harming animals, threatening classmates, and writing about violence in his journals. In his teenage years, Alexander claimed he realized that taking lives gave him a rush of power. He began fantasizing about ending as many lives as possible, and even started planning how to keep track of his score. He decided to use a chessboard which has 64 squares as a symbol of his goal, to take 64 lives, one for each square. By the late 1990s, Alexander had chosen Bitzer Park as his hunting ground. It was perfect, vast, quiet, and largely unpatrolled, especially at night. He would lure victims, often homeless people or those struggling with addiction, into the park with offers of vodka and companionship. He carried a bag with a bottle of vodka, some food, and a hammer. After sharing drinks, he would suddenly strike, leaving his victims near secluded paths where they were unlikely to be discovered right away. Between 2001 and 2006, the number of bodies found in and around Bitzer Park began to rise. At first, police dismissed them as unrelated accidents or drunken fights gone wrong. But Alexander kept count. He carved notches into his chessboard and recorded details of each attack in a notebook. By his own confession, he claimed he had ended over 60 lives before he was caught. In 2006, a young woman named Marina disappeared after telling her family she was going for a walk with a man she knew from work. Her family gave police his name and his address. When officers searched Alexander's apartment, they found his chessboard with dozens of squares marked in pen and a journal filled with names and dates. The pieces of the puzzle finally came together. Alexander's trial became one of the most closely watched in modern Russian history. Calm and expressionless in court, he spoke about his crimes with no sign of regret. "For me," he said, "a life without killing is like a life without food." When asked why he targeted so many people, he said he wanted to surpass another infamous Russian killer, Andrei Chikatilo, whom we discussed earlier, and become the most prolific in Russia's history. He was convicted of 49 counts, though he claimed his true number was over 60. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement. Psychologists described Alexander as a calculating, organized predator who saw killing as a personal challenge rather than an emotional act. He viewed each victim as a move in his game, a step toward his self-imposed goal. "He turned murder into a sport," said one investigator. His story is a sobering reminder of how dangerous a determined and methodical predator can be. It also shows how easy it can be for such a person to operate unnoticed when their victims are marginalized, people society often overlooks. Alexander Pichushkin wanted to fill his chessboard, but behind every square he marked was a real person, with a family, a history, a name. His actions left an indelible scar on Moscow, and his victims deserve to be remembered, not just as pieces in his game, but as human.
The Treaty of Versailles had left the economy shattered, crime was rampant, and countless young people, many of them orphans or runaways, roamed the streets, searching for food and shelter. In the city of Hanover, one man preyed on this desperation. He offered kindness, food, and warmth, but behind closed doors, Fritz Hamann was carrying out one of the most horrifying killing sprees in European history. Fritz Hamann was born in 1879 in Hanover to a working-class family. From childhood, Fritz was described as strange and unpredictable. He was shy and quiet, but also prone to sudden violent outbursts. As a teenager, he was sent to a reform school for inappropriate behavior and later spent time in psychiatric institutions. Though he trained as a locksmith, he never held a steady job for long. Instead, he drifted through life, living on the fringes of society. By his 30s, Fritz had developed a reputation in Hanover as a petty criminal, stealing, forging, and running small-time scams. Ironically, he also worked as a police informant. This position gave him unusual access to police operations, as well as a level of trust that allowed him to avoid suspicion when young people began to disappear. After the war, Hanover was filled with homeless boys and young men, many of them sleeping at the train station or begging for food. Fritz would approach them there, offering a warm meal, a place to sleep, and sometimes even work. For those with nowhere else to turn, the offer was irresistible. He would lead them to his small apartment near the river, and they were never seen again. Between 1918 and 1924, dozens of boys and young men disappeared in Hanover. Most were written off as runaways, but neighbors began to notice strange things. Fritz was often seen carrying heavy sacks into the river late at night. He also sold large quantities of second-hand clothing at the market, clothes that seemed far too nice for someone of his means. When asked about the boys who stayed with him, he claimed they had simply moved on to find work elsewhere. In May 1924, two boys playing near the river Liner discovered a human skull. Police dragged the river and soon found more remains, dozens of bones scattered in the water. The investigation eventually led them to Fritz Harman. When police raided his apartment, they found bloodstains on the walls, floor, and bed. Neighbors described hearing strange noises at night, cries, screams, and a heavy chopping sound. Fritz Harman's trial in late 1924 captivated Germany. He was charged with 24 counts of taking lives, though he allegedly confessed to as many as 50. In court, he described how he lured his victims in, gained their trust, and ended their lives. The press dubbed him the Butcher of Hanover because of the way he disposed of his victims, carefully cutting them up and discarding the remains in the river. He showed little emotion throughout, calmly explaining his actions as though he were describing a routine chore. Even gone. After a trial that lasted weeks, Fritz Harman was found guilty of 24 counts and sentenced to death. In April 1925, he was executed by guillotine. Even as he faced his final moments, he showed no remorse, reportedly smiling and saying he was glad it was all over. Psychologists who studied the case described Fritz as a classic predator, manipulative, cruel, and without empathy. His charm and ability to appear harmless allowed him to get close to his victims who never realized the danger they were in until it was too late. One criminologist said, "He was a wolf in the skin of a shepherd." His story is a chilling reminder of how predators exploit the most vulnerable, those who have no family, no home, and no one to notice when they're gone. It also highlights the danger of complacency. Even those who work with police can use that trust as a shield. The boys and young men who lost their lives at the hands of Fritz Harman came to Hanover looking for hope, for work, for safety. Instead, they were met with cruelty. Tonight, we remember them and vow to never let their memory fade into the river that carried them away. Alaska is a land of extremes, vast, beautiful, and wild. For many, it's a place of adventure and freedom, but for more than a decade, one man turned the Alaskan wilderness into his own hunting ground. He was a quiet baker, a family man in Anchorage, but in the frozen forests outside town, Robert Hansen lived a double life, one of the most chilling and calculated predatory sprees in American history. Robert Hansen was born in 1939 in Estherville, Iowa. As a boy, he was painfully shy, socially awkward, and plagued by a severe stutter. He was bullied in school, rejected by girls, and grew up with a deep sense of anger and humiliation. Hansen later said these feelings festered into resentment that he carried with him for the rest of his life. He found solace in hunting. Out in the woods, he didn't have to talk, didn't have to fit in, and he developed remarkable skill with a rifle and a bow. In the 1960s, Robert moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he opened a small bakery. To his neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary man, a quiet, hard-working baker who liked to hunt and kept to himself. He married and had children. He even set several local hunting records, admired by his peers for his skill and patience in the wilderness. But beneath this calm exterior, Hansen was harboring a dark fantasy. In the 1970s, women in Anchorage, often dancers or sex workers, began disappearing. Many were young, new to town, and struggling to make a living. Because of the lifestyle of the victims, police were slow to investigate. For years, Hansen was able to operate without suspicion. Hansen's method was chilling in its calculation.
He would lure women to his home, promising money or work. Once there, he would restrain them and sometimes keep them in his basement for hours or even days. Then, he would force them into his small private plane and fly them into the wilderness outside Anchorage. Deep in the frozen forests, miles from civilization, he would let them go, but only to hunt them like animals. With his hunting rifle, he stalked his victims through the woods before finishing his pursuit. In 1983, a woman escaped from Hansen and ran to the police. Her testimony led investigators to Hansen's home, where they found jewelry belonging to missing women, as well as an aviation map of the area with tiny X marks, each one indicating a location where he had left a victim. Police eventually connected him to at least 17 deaths, though some believe the true number may have been more than 20. Hansen was arrested and charged in 1983. In court, he showed little emotion, quietly admitting to many of the charges and giving investigators a detailed account of his crimes. He was sentenced to 461 years in prison, ensuring he would never be free again. Robert Hansen was described by psychologists as a classic example of someone who externalized his resentment, blaming others for his own failures. He targeted women he perceived as vulnerable, justifying his actions by telling himself they deserved it. One investigator said he wanted to control everything: the chase, the fear, the end. In a through state and need day, and is the challenge someone may three. So, he highlights the danger of underestimating those who seem quiet and unassuming. It also shows how predators often target those they think won't be missed, people already on the margins of society. The women who lost their lives in the Alaskan wilderness had families, dreams, and futures that were taken from them. Tonight, we remember them, not as faceless names on a map, but as individuals who deserved better. Their memory serves as a powerful reminder that every life matters, and that no one should ever be written off as invisible. Across these 10 stories, we've seen how cruelty can wear many faces: a friendly neighbor, a trusted nurse, a quiet baker, even a respected businessman. What they all had in common was a willingness to see other people as less than human and to exploit their trust, their vulnerability, and their invisibility. We tell these stories not to glorify these men and women, but to remember their victims, and to remind ourselves that vigilance, compassion, and justice must always go hand in hand. Thank you for staying.